share. Now let me move to, okay. Can everybody see my slide?
Perfect.
Yes, perfect.
Okay, great. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to give a talk. I've not been to these particular thermodynamics conferences earlier on. So this is a good place for me to present some of these ideas that we've been working in the last 5 to 10 years. My background, I'm a physicist, do thermodynamics and been interested in self-organization for a long time. Almost 10 years ago, this question about machines and organisms came about in some project I was working. And I'll present what we have, what kind of progress we've made in trying to answer this question. So everybody knows that intuitively there's a difference between machines and organisms. We look at a bird and we want to make something that looks like a flies, and then we end up with an airplane. Airplane flies much better than a bird, serves us very well, but it's fundamentally different from, we all know that there's something fundamentally different between the two. Same thing with motion generated by animals. Stronger animals give us the ability to move things, and we want to make something similar. And highly organized, complicated populations of nature create these forests. We want to do the same thing, and we get these geometrical cities and the brain and so on. So you get the point that things, organisms, and the kind of machines that we make, cities we build, are fundamentally different. They look different. So what is the difference? This question was pondered over by Robert Rosen, who is a biophysicist and mathematical biologist. And he has made some very insightful remarks that I greatly benefited from reading his book. It's called Essays on Life Itself. Rosen pointed out the following about machines and organisms. If you break apart a machine and take a look at it and how it functions, you kind of know how to build one too. So if you analyze its work, the way it works, you also gain a knowledge of how to synthesize a machine, how to put together a machine. Not so with organisms. We've been looking at living cells for over 100 years with microscopes. We know a huge amount of how it works, all the complicated biochemistry and everything, but we don't know how to make one. So what's the difference? I think the fundamental difference originates from the processes that make machines, and it goes much deeper into the distinction between mechanics and thermodynamics. So that's the essence of my talk, the deep distinction between mechanics and thermodynamics that enables us to see these two systems as quite different in their makeup, in their science. So the process that brings about a machine we call technology, right? We made it up. But the process that brings about an organism is a dissipative process. Organism exists and functions as long as entropy generating dissipative processes are working. I was asking Terence Deacon this question about viruses because there are self-organizing equilibrium systems like crystals, but they don't need any dissipative process. Once it's formed, it stays there, it's stable in given conditions, of course, given environment. But dissipative structures, their entire structure depends on constant entropy generation. So a very quick, a few slides, the distinction between mechanics and thermodynamics. Mechanics, of course, has its origin in Newton, Leibniz, and others, Laplace, Lagrange. It has these concepts of mass, momentum, and force. And the laws of mechanics are time reversible. You take a movie of a physical process described by mechanics and run it backwards in time. the reverse process does not violate any fundamental laws of physics. It's very complicated. People say it's unlikely and so on and so forth, but there is no distinction between past and future, going one in direction or the other. I contend that this world of mechanics gave us machines. It is a world in which reversibility is fundamental. So we built machines based on this science that mechanics has given us. So mechanics says the irreversibility is just a question of complexity and probability and so on. That's a whole philosophical question. But on the box on the right side, I want to point out that the machines that are based on mechanics are such that irreversible processes like friction, heat generation, and all those are to be minimized to make the machine work more efficiently. In fact, they are a nuisance you have to get rid of. And machines have context-independent parts. You take a cog out of a machine, that cog will work like a cog in another place. There's no context dependence. You won't see this much in organisms. You can take one man's heart and transplant it in another man, and the immune system comes back and tries to attack it. So there's a context in which every living organism lives. And there are also context in the toaster, whether it's here or somewhere else, is a toaster. It certainly doesn't morph into function slightly differently if I move to a colder climate. Now let's move to thermodynamics, and this is an audience that are experts in thermodynamics. So I just spent 3 minutes distinguishing between the 19th century thermodynamics and modern thermodynamics that gave us an understanding of structures that are eventually organisms. So classical thermodynamics, 19th century of Carnot, Clausius, Kelvin, and others, they gave us a thermodynamics in which we can calculate the changes in entropy only for reversible processes. And in nature, of course, there are no practically reversible processes. And a system goes from a state A, as shown on the right side, to state B, to an irreversible process that takes a finite time. But we say, well, the change in entropy doesn't depend on the path. So we will create a fictitious reversible path, which is infinitely slow, et cetera, and calculate it using the reversible path process, this one. And we can calculate entropy. In classical thermodynamics, you will not find the time derivative of anything. It is all initial and final state. Processes are not included. So if you look at classical thermodynamics or physical chemistry books, there is thermodynamics in one part and kinetics in the other part. They are two separate things. But in 20th century, things changed due to the contributions of Lars Onsager and Ilya Prigogine. They made thermodynamics a science that describes processes. So changes in entropy are divided into two parts: the entropy of exchange between a system and its environment, and entropy produced intrinsically by irreversible processes within the system. And the second law is the statement, every process in nature only increases entropy. And this framework gave us an understanding of a different kind of self-organization, quite distinct from equilibrium self-organization or self-assembly like a crystal. This is a little bit of detail, but all I want to point out is we know how to calculate the changes of entropy due to exchange of energy and matter with the outside of the system, and changes in entropy generated within the system, irreversible processes generating this entropy within the system can be calculated in terms of thermodynamic forces and thermodynamic flows. So this you can find in any textbook. But these systems, non-equilibrium systems, with this theory, we were able to understand things, systems that spontaneously organize themselves. Here is an example. Below, there's a mechanical clock coming out of the theory of mechanics. And above, there's also a clock. That's a chemical clock. We just dump a bunch of chemicals in it, with proper concentrations. And the concentrations of this compound, intermediate compound, oscillates back and forth. So we have a clock like that. And this theory of non-equilibrium thermodynamics, originating with the work of Onsager and Prigogine, is able to explain this. But the key point is that this clock works only because of dissipative processes. Those chemical reactions are continuously generating entropy. There is no clock without any chemical reaction taking place. No structure, nothing, unlike a regular clock. Now, the world of thermodynamics, this world of thermodynamics where irreversible processes have a fundamental aspect in play a fundamental role in creating structure, gave us this self-organization, which Prigogine termed as dissipative structures, because the structure is maintained only by dissipative process. If there's no dissipative process, the structure will fall apart. Like the example of Bernard convection that Terence Deacon presented. As long as the flow of heat, the structure of the convective rolls is maintained. You turn off the heat and it'll die. So in the world of self-organization and dissipative structures, irreversible processes are essential in contrast to machines where they are a nuisance. Without entropy production, there is no structure at all. And open systems that are not far from equilibrium constantly are interacting with the environment. And therefore, they are naturally context dependent. And we do draw boundaries, but often this boundary is questionable. If you draw a boundary around me and say you're a human being, you're a live being, I said, well, I can't live without the trees. So the trees and I are interacting. Why do you draw the line and say I am one person, one living creature, and the tree is a different living creature? Why aren't we a system that's working together? So there is some arbitrariness that we draw in terms of boundaries, but it's a very useful thing to draw boundaries to understand it. And so in open systems that are all interconnected, context dependence is a natural consequence, unlike machines. Now I want to show you a video of something which is more like organism, but it is not a living organism. Let me start the video. Oops. I'll start the video and stop it for a second just to explain what it is you're seeing. Oops, sorry. So what you're seeing is a ball bearing, stainless steel ball bearings in a layer of oil. We just throw them. The ring you see is one electrode, and the thing on top, you see a white tube-like thing, is the second electrode placed about 5-6 centimeters above the surface of the oil. And a high voltage is applied between the two, about 20,000 volts. Look what happens. You're seeing the process of self-organization, which is quite different from oscillating chemical reactions. It forms a kind of worm-like structure. It's got all these branches. You can call it a tree if you like. And you saw the self-organization part. This is self-healing. If you go and break off one of the arms, it'll move around and reform that arm. Not exactly the way you broke it, but before it was broken, but it forms again. And when the tree forms, actually the formation of a tree can be understood in a very similar way with Bernard convection. The system is trying to find a way to access more current, increase the flow of current. In this slide, we show the current and the different stages of the system. Initially, you see these different stages. This is the current we are measuring, and this is just before the tree is complete. And as soon as the tree is formed, the current jumps. The formation of a tree can be interpreted as the system's morphing itself to draw more current. And instead of making this very specific as current, we want to make this criterion more general. And so we think of it as generation of entropy production, generation of entropy or entropy production. So the system is trying to increase the entropy production, somewhat consistent with a principle that a lot of people are applying called the maximum entropy principle. This is sort of consistent with it. And we can calculate the entropy production, we can measure it. The system is simple enough to be able to do all that, but yet it's fairly complicated. If you repeat the process, if you turn off the current, put the beads together and run it, it'll form a tree which is different than our worm, if you like to call it. It'll have a different shape. But regardless of what the shape is, the change in current and the final level it'll reach is about the same. So given a number of beads and certain voltage, the system morphs and finds a way to get maximum current that it can, given those conditions. It can have different trees, but it'll always get there. So if in terms of end-directed evolution, the system is trying to reach the maximum current, and it can reach it through very different tree patterns. So here is a summary of all the different kinds of trees that we looked at, and then current generated by each tree. It's pretty close. There's small variations, of course. And if you want to see more details about it, there are a couple of papers that came out on this, one in Physical Review, Rapid Publications, and one in Chaos, which summarizes more of it. So this gives us some progress towards these dissipative structures that have some lifelike properties. Now, I said, we began to wonder why this tree is moving at all. Why does it move like a worm? What is it trying to do? Well, there are two answers to it. One is the fluid itself is convecting and is doing it. The movement of the fluid is fairly complicated. With 20,000 volts, all kinds of things happen to the fluid. By the way, that 20,000 volts won't kill anyone because the current is microamps. So the power is less than 1 watt. So we don't have to worry about the high voltage. So it is one concept that comes out of this study, is that if you call the function as getting maximum current possible within that environment, there's a lot of variability in the structure that arrives at the same function. This you can see in organisms too. There's different variability of structure, but they're accomplishing the same thing. Now we began to wonder if this motion of the tree can be studied in more detail and see if it is actually seeking out more current that sustains itself. So we conducted this following experiment. In this video, to make things simple, we take a tree with just one branch so that it's not too expanded. We first constrain the tree to one part of the ring electrode. It slides along the ring electrode. And we put it in a place where the current it can get is not maximum. It can move to another location and get more current. And there are, I don't know if you can see, but there are two plastic, actually straws that are holding them in place. In a few seconds, you'll see that one of them is lifted. Oops. Okay, I won't touch my mouse. In a few minutes, you will see, or a few seconds, one of the constraining straws will be lifted, and the tree seeks out a location where it can draw more current. If you want to think of it as an organism, this lives on electrons, and it go find where it can get more electrons. And the flow of electrons, of course, keeps the tree. If there's no flow of electrons, it dies. Now the constraint is lifted, and to keep the conditions identical, if it's placed in the same place, the straw is put back exactly where it was. And the tree is moving. And so we followed, we recorded the current as this process is taking place. And I will show that to you in the next slide. In this slide, we see the current when the tree is constrained. And at this point, one of the constraining spots is lit, and the area where it can draw more current, and you can see the current goes up. So it is actually, we want to call it end directed, because it is directed towards the end of drawing more current. It's finding ways, moving around to find more current. In that sense, it's end directed. It's like thermodynamics, if you want to use Deacon's terminology. I want to show you in this little video that what's going on is fairly complicated. I hope you can see the video enough. There are particles floating that show how the oil is actually convecting in there. So a lot of complicated stuff is going on there. And the outcome of all this is this end directedness, that it will go to a place where it will draw more currents. And so that brings us to a summary of the contrast between design structures and dissipative structures. Design structures are machines. They're generally based on the laws of mechanics and computer logic. These structures are designed by an external process. They are not self-organizing. Entropy generation in these systems is actually unwanted. It makes the system inefficient. They're not self-healing. If they break, they don't reassemble. Equilibrium structures like a virus or a crystal somewhat does. But in a typical machines like a watch, if it breaks, it doesn't fix itself. And there's no function-independent variability. That is, different structures which are very different looking from each other, performing the same function. Dissipative structures, on the other hand, based on irreversible entropy-producing processes, and their structure forming processes within the system. Entropy-generating processes are essential. Without them, the structure ceases to exist. They're self-healing, and also it can be context-dependent. And we have done a lot of experiments with this system, and there are so much more, but I just want to give you the basic point about this whole research we are doing. And I want to conclude by making a few comments. End-directedness in thermodynamics is not new. In fact, most of thermodynamics, classical and modern, is end-directed. The classical thermodynamics says an isolated system will reach its maximum state of maximum entropy. It doesn't tell you how, but we know it's going to get there. Same thing with constrained systems, minimum Helmholtz energy or minimum gives energy. We predict where it's going to go, but we can't tell exactly how it's going to go. And from this and a lot of other work, it seems like there is another principle which is end-directed. Systems will evolve dissipative structures to reach a state of maximum entropy. But a physicist will balk at the idea that entropy, maximum entropy production is a fundamental law of nature, because we could point out several examples where it's not valid. A simple, ohmic heating of a resistor doesn't follow this law. As the resistor gets hotter, the resistance increases and the current decreases. So there are a class of systems for which this is valid, maximum entropy production. But my position is that we have not a full grasp of what this class is. But there's quite a lot of interest in this, and rightly so. So my conclusion is, organisms are not a subset of machines, as a lot of people want to do it. In fact, we keep thinking even living organisms, people and our morphologies of living things in terms of machines. So you go to a doctor, he says, oh, this is your blood circulation system, that's the plumbing, and this is your heart, this is that. Because we don't really have a paradigm to think about organisms in ways other than some kind of a complicated machine. And so this audience will get, we need to create a different paradigm to understand organisms. The machine paradigm is not going to work for us. So in the 21st century, I hope—
I have 3 minutes left.
Okay. This will lead to thermodynamics that will give us a better understanding of organisms, and we should go away from any mechanics to describe this. I think I'll stop there in case there are questions. Sorry, my time's rather short.
Thank you very much. Really interesting ideas. I'm sure there must be some questions. Please activate the microphone, whoever wants to ask a question.
I have a question. So it's clear that when you look at your system, it presupposes that there is an environment that is not directed, I think, to the same extent in the same way. In other words, if the greater environment is similarly directed towards optimizing the same sorts of conditions that the embedded system is, then it would seem to me that the larger system would have to take precedence. And we'd have this hierarchy of smaller systems embedded within the largest system. And then that largest system would ultimately be directive. Can you sort of teleologically expand your arguments to everything here, all systems, so that I can understand where this ends?
But let's take the example, the experiment I showed. The larger context is the flow of current, right? Availability of voltage in the flow of current. So what I guess we are seeing is, under this application of the voltage, the subsystem is morphing itself to decrease resistance. And this is a very complicated process. So in a more thermodynamic way, I guess we want to say, I don't know exactly how it's going to do that, but it'll find a way to increase the current. We give it away, it'll increase the current. It will, for example, if you have many simple small trees, the total current is lower. So if there are many small trees, they'll all merge together and form a bigger tree where the current is higher. So just in that sense, I'm talking about this principle that there's an end-directedness. Now, if you ask me, is there an end-directness to the entire system? I don't know what exactly you mean by that. Subject to an energy flow, the system's behavior seems to find ways to increase the rate of entropy production. The same thing is true with Bénard convection. once the convective rolls form, the rate of transport of heat gets higher. The rate of entropy production gets higher.
Thank you so much. I think the time is over.